think we can go ahead.
Okay. Let's see here. There is everyone able to see the ImagesPlus window that I've got open?
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, good. So I know there were a few users I saw log in there. I saw Art Cole log in. Art, I'm going to bore you to tears tonight because I'm going to go over all the stuff that you already know.
That's fine, Blair.
What's that?
That's fine. I'll be okay.
You're just here to heckle, huh?
That's right.
Fair enough. So what I'm going to do tonight, I'm going to give a very quick tour of the software package, and I'm going to concentrate on the first step of image processing with ImagesPlus, which is stretching the image, brightening it up, and making some of the faint parts of the object visible. So the target we're going to play with tonight, sorry, what was that, Troy?
Just wondering if it's being recorded and if I want to start for this.
Yes, it is being recorded.
So at any rate, very first step, obviously, I'll just close this down, is to, bear with me a minute. I have to move the ribbon from the top of my screen. There we go. So the very, very first step, obviously, is to open an image. Now, before you have any images open in ImagesPlus, you will only have a couple of menu items on the top of the screen. Those are...
Okay, we're not quite catching your audio.
Are
Is anyone else having problems with the audio?
Yeah, I am.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Wait now.
We can hear you now, but maybe not at the beginning of a sentence.
Yeah, it looks like I got logged out and logged back in, which is interesting. Okay, is it still there?
Yeah, you're back. We can hear you.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes. No.
No.
I wonder if we should all get rid of our video, if that would help.
No, it's something at this end. Bear with me a minute. I just have to find out what. I may actually have to log out and log back in. I can see everybody, but I can no longer get access to the toolbar to share my screen. So give me just a minute. I'm going to log off and log back in. Jerry, as the host, you'll probably have to unshare my screen.
I don't think so. I think you're not a host, but as soon as you talk, you should be.
Okay, so I'm going to log out and log back in so that I can get my screen back here. Bear with me just a couple minutes.
I guess I will make him a host when he comes back in.
I just want to make sure I didn't miss anything. Has he given us files to work with or not?
I didn't quite catch that.
I'm just curious. I think he said he was going to give us files that we could download to work together. Has he given us that yet?
I haven't seen that file show up yet.
He sent an email yesterday, I think, with the DM8. I believe it was in the Dropbox.
All right, good.
Okay, I'll take a look.
It was either Bear that sent it or Judy.
There, I'm back in now, Jerry.
Good. I'm going to make you.
Actually, you can stay as host. That shouldn't be a problem.
Okay.
And I will just share my screen. That's the way we were working there before, and it seemed to work okay.
Do you have a link for the file that you had?
Judy sent it out in an email to the list. 1 second. It's a Dropbox link, so if I can get it out of my email here, bear with me. open this up. I just have to get to Dropbox. One sec.
I just copied it into the chat.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so there it is. It's in the chat window now. And anyone that doesn't have the image, if they want to use it to follow along, you're welcome to. The reason I put that there is that a couple of people have asked, they tried some of the things that I showed to stretch images the other night, and it didn't work out so well for them. And the reason is, whatever settings you see me use are very specific to the image I'm working on. Do not expect them to work on any other image. So when you have your own images, you will have to experiment with the various sliders to get the right settings. It's a common misconception in image processing that there's a good setting for the sliders that works for everything. It does not exist. So you will have to experiment with every image you work with. And it really doesn't matter what package you use. That's just a fact of life in image processing. So here we are here, as I said, we've got the image open. And now you can see we have several more menu items. We have the view menus, which allow you to zoom in and out and duplicate images, that sort of thing. We have the geometric image, which allows you to do sort of geometric transforms of the image so you can mirror it, do all the usual stuff. You can come down to transforms, which allows you to shift the image up and down, left and right. It allows you to scale the image, and of course it allows you to rotate the image as well. The menu item that we're going to be looking at tonight is the stretch menu item, and the very first thing you want to do to your image is stretch it enough to make things visible. Now, there are, as you can see, a whole variety of stretching options available. There are two that you want to concentrate on for the very first stretch of your image, and they're specifically designed for that. You don't usually use them after the first stretch, and it's digital development here and ArcSignH. So I'm going to pick ArcSignH. Digital development works quite nicely as well. It's just a little less aggressive than the ArcSignH. The original ArcSignH stretch follows an ArcSignH curve, of course, but its advantages are that it prevents star bloat better than most other stretches, and it also gives you reasonable control of color. Now, ImagesPlus has a couple of things that are available both in the ArcSignH stretch and the digital development stretch to recover color. So you'll find it's really easy to keep color while stretching. It's not so easy in some other packages where as you stretch it, you tend to lose a lot of color in the image. So we'll open the ArcSignH stretch, and I've got to collapse my video windows here. Bear with me. There we go.
So you're doing this first before anything else?
Or anything else, we want to stretch the image.
Ooh.
If you look at things like PixInsight separates things into what they call linear processing and nonlinear processing. That's a PixInsight model. There's not a lot of other people out there that do that. There are mathematical reasons for doing it. When your goal is to make a pretty picture, it simply doesn't matter. So ImagesPlus is certainly do scientific image processing with it. You have to know the right order to do things in then. But in terms of making a pretty picture, the very first thing you want to do is stretch it so that you can see the image. The other thing ImagesPlus does not have that PixInsight users will be familiar with, there is no screen stretch. So what you do is applied to the image. So here's the ArcSignH Stretch dialog or window, as it were. And it's got three different sections. The first section is called Stretch, even though it's the middle section here, and it specifies the ArcSignH curve. The top section, called HDR pre-stretch, all that really does is it moves the input data along that curve, so you can get different effects and slightly different pre-stretches, as it were, which make a big difference in the final image depending upon what you're processing. And the third section is the section I mentioned earlier to decompress color. as you stretch an image, if you can picture you have a star, for example, and let's say it's a red star, it has a little bit of green and a little bit of blue in terms of pixel values, but the predominant value is in the red. But if you stretch that star far enough, you will saturate the red, green, and blue channels, and that star will look white. So color decompression allows you to effectively boost the saturation on a per color basis to get a lot of the color back in the image. Won't really be a big problem with this image because color won't really be an issue, but I'll show you it in operation as we go here. So the very first thing you want to do is make some of the nebula. This, by the way, is, as you can see from the title, an image of M8. And first thing we want to do is to take this power slider and we want to slide it to the left. Now, Mike Unsold, the gentleman that wrote this particular program, has a bit of a mathematical background, and there are reasons why he made the slider go right to left as opposed to left to right, and they're mathematical in nature. It was a dumb decision. He really should have done what everyone else did and made it go from darker over here to lighter over here, but what can I say? Just sort of read what it says. It's darker on this side, lighter as you move the slider this way. Don't go overboard in any of the adjustments you do. So for instance, if we just barely move that slider and we wait a second or two, now you can see the nebula. If we move the slider a whole lot, you can see more of the nebula, but the stars start to saturate and bloom. So the temptation is to move this slider over and make everything really bright. And although that will give you an image, it will not give you the best image and it will give you a lot of noise. So I would say avoid that temptation. It is much better to do smaller stretches and do more of them. And that's the same for any package you're working with, whether it's Photoshop, PixInsight, or whatever. It's better to do it in small steps. So we'll work with a small stretch on this image to begin with. You can see the nebula here. You'll notice the background is heavily clipped, right? You don't see much of it at all. If you look down, if you look down in this area, this is the pixel values in red, green, and blue where my cursor is positioned. So if you look here, it's 0, 0, 0. The background is all 0 and clipped. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to bring the background up a little bit. And that is the function of this background weight slider. So if we take that background weight and slide it again to the left, the further we move it to the left, the more background will be taken into the image. So I'm only sliding it a little bit. You can see now that the background is not actually black. It's actually got some value to it. You can slide that over to the point where the background dominates the image, as you can see, and you lose the nebula altogether. But there's a catch to this. The further to the left you slide this slider, the lower the noise level will be. The further you leave it toward the right, the higher the noise level will be and the lower the background will be. So what you want to do is you want to balance the noise relative to the background level. So what we're going to do, I'm going to zoom right in on this now and show you what I mean. Everybody see the noise in the background on that image?
Yep.
Okay. As I slide this further to the left, watch what happens to that noise. It should reduce a little bit. See what I mean? Noise is still there. It's just the background level has gotten a little bit higher now, and it tends to cover up the noise. You do not want to slide that so far to the left, however, that you tend to wipe out the nebula. I'm pretty much beginning to wipe the nebula out there now, and there's a way to fix that, so just bear with me. But before we do, I just want to show you what some of these other sliders will do. So I'm going to just dial this back a bit so you can see the effect a little better. There we are. So now we can see we've got some dark areas of the nebula, but there will be quite a bit of noise because I've moved the background weight slider further to the right. And if we zoom in here, you can now see all that noise that I'm talking about. You can also see a few hot pixels. When I combined this data, I didn't use a min-max excluded average. I just used a straight average. and that left some of the hot pixels in my image.
That was dithered. That's why you have it in more than one spot.
That is correct, yes. So now if I go back to the wider image scale here. So now what we're going to do, the next slider I want to introduce everyone to is this background minimum. And that's exactly what it says. It sets the minimum value in the background. So if there was a spot in this image that had a background weight of 0, as I slide this slider up, it will add a value to every pixel in the image to set the value for that darkest spot. So if I say I want the darkest spot to have a value of, I'll just pick something, say 939 in this case, it will add 939 to every pixel in the image. So if I slide that along, you'll see the background will get brighter, but all the bright stuff will get quite bright as well. So generally, I leave that slider almost all the way to the right, or to the left rather, and I will maybe turn it up a little bit depending upon the image. So before we go any further, I'm going to introduce one more tool here that is always important while stretching, and that's the histogram tool. I selected it just by pulling the histogram tool button here, and I want you to take a look at this particular histogram. So I'm going to undo the stretch that I've done, and we'll just wait a second for the undo to take effect. So what you're seeing in this histogram now is the bulk of the black data, this dark sky, that's this central, or this peak right here. That's where the majority of the pixels are in this image. They're all at the dark end. There are a few pixels up at this end of the image, and that represents these bright stars. This stuff right here is basically all crap. The reason I say that, if we redo the stretch, I want you to take a look at this image. Here we go. You notice this black or dark line at the top. There's one down this side, it's very thin, and there's a little one on this side that's quite thin as well. That's all of the data from, let's put that from this area of the image. And that's caused by, as Jerry said, when I captured this image, I dithered it. What that means is the telescope moved a little bit between the frames, and it helps take down some of the noise. But it does leave borders around your image if you do a straight average, which is what I've done with this image. There are fewer images that have that data in them after the stars have been aligned, and it tends to lower the overall average in those areas. What I'm going to do to make a little more sense out of the histogram, I'm just going to crop those areas. So if we redo the stretch, we'll wait just a second, you'll see that it starts about here. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to ever so slightly crop that image. There's no need to, by the way. You don't need to crop it while you're processing. I'm only doing this so that the histogram will make more sense to people. So I'm going to just slightly crop this image starting about, say, here. And all I did is I selected the crop tool from the toolbar, and then you just draw the area you want to keep, and it will crop everything else out of the image. So here we are here. So now when you look at this image, you'll notice that the histogram falls down very sharply here. This is the sky background, and there's no pixels below the sky background. You'll notice in this image, once the histogram recalculates, there are pixels below the sky background, and that was from that dark border at the top. So if we go back to this cropped version of the image, as I said, there's no real need to crop it other than trying to make sure everyone understands what they're seeing with the histogram. And we can now reapply this stretch. So if we reapply this stretch, I just click the apply button here because the stretch is all set. You'll notice what it's done. It's shifted the bright stars up here. As more and more stars saturate, you will see this climb. So you want to avoid that if you can. You don't want to saturate your stars early in the processing. And you also don't want to clip the black background. You notice it's clipped here. There are some pixels in this image that have a value of 0. So what we're going to do, we're going to take the background weight slider, and I'm going to move it over a little bit. To see if
Excuse me, Blair. Where is the histogram tool in the menu?
It is See this button right here?
Yeah, okay, good, thanks.
It's there. It's also under modeling. You'll see histogram under modeling right there.
Thank you.
Okay. So what I've done now is I've taken the background weight and I've slid it over just a little more. What that's done is, and I'll undo it here so you can see. Watch the bottom end of the histogram. There is a heavily clipped image. As I slide this over, the image will become less and less clipped. So you can see it's still clipped, but less so. And what you want to do, you want to make sure that you're not clipping the black point in your image. So there we are there, it's no longer clipped. The image might look a little low contrast and it might look a little washed out, but the background is not clipped. And that's quite important for what we're trying to do here. You do not want to lose data in the bottom end of your image by clipping the black point. You notice that when I move the background slider, I didn't saturate any more of the stars. It really only affects the bottom end of the image. So now what we're going to do, we're going to take this.
Blair, before you go any further, I'm missing, can you turn back and just point to where the tool is for cropping?
Yes, sorry, it's this.
I missed it. Oh, okay, thank you.
You can also get it under special functions, copy a portion of the image. What it does, it doesn't actually crop the image, it makes a copy of the area that you select.
Okay.
Okay, so
Thank
that
you.
effectively crops it.
Yeah.
So now you can see we have an almost reasonable looking image of M8. It's not perfect by any means yet, but it's pretty reasonable. And all we've done so far is move a couple of sliders. So the next thing we really want to do is now we're going to take a look at some of the other functions here. So for instance, we've set now the curve that this image uses. So it uses a curve that's got a very slight stretch. And excuse me, I could even take that down a little more. For instance, if I stretch it a little less, you'll notice the image will now get a little darker, right? But you notice I didn't really change the saturation there, and I didn't drop this too much. What I have, though, is a little bit more pleasing contrast in the image. This is where I mentioned before that the settings are very tailored to the given image that you're working with, and be prepared to experiment quite a bit to get the right settings. So for instance, if I take a little more of the stretch out, there it got a little bit darker. But what that's doing that you can't see until I zoom in, and bear with me till I move the histogram out of the way so I can get the zoom buttons. By the way, the zoom buttons are here. There's some preset zooms. These will zoom in and out by, I've got it set to zoom by 5%. It's one of the settings that you can adjust. And there are a couple of other zoom features as well. But if we zoom in 100%, notice the noise in the corner here. If I take this and I slide it up, I'm going to emphasize that noise quite a bit. You notice? So I want to get the minimum stretch that will give me the image I want, but keep the noise as low as I can make it. So if we look here now, we've got a reasonable image, right? We can play around a little bit more. Ideally, you do not want to drop this area of the histogram down to 0. The reason is you want to be able to do other processing later, and you don't want to clip the background while you're doing it. When you're finished completely with the image, with the processing, you can actually set this level to be 0 with another stretch tool, which I'll show you in a minute. So you get the idea that the histogram display is actually quite important while you're stretching an image. What you want to do, you want to prevent as much clipping on the stars here as you can. The more they clip, the more color you lose in the stars. You want to prevent the background from clipping so you don't lose all this faint gas and dust in the image that's all around the periphery of M8. So next thing we want to try and do now is we can dial up the contrast a little bit. There's a couple of ways of doing that, but we're going to use the pre-stretch. So this HDR pre-stretch has a couple of different ways of manipulating the image. Now what you're doing here you're actually sliding the data set up and down the, I don't have a drawing of an ArcSignH curve, but you're actually sliding the data set, the input data set, up and down that curve. So we've got, you can set it to none, in which case it has no effect, none of the sliders are active. You can set it to linear, in which case it takes the data set from minimum to maximum and slides the whole data set up and down the curve, and it slides it together. So if you say you slide the bright area 50% of the way up the curve, you would slide the dim area 50% as well. So to give you an example here, if we now take this and slide this up, you can see what happens. The whole curve shifted toward the left, and I start to saturate some stars. You notice there's a bigger histogram peak here. Again, if I go the other way, now I drop the whole image down. This comes well away from the left edge, and I haven't dropped that all the way down, but I've now lowered the brightness of the image quite a bit. Black point, we'll get to that. I'm just going to slide this back to a value of about 1 here, which is where it, which is its default value. That's close enough. What the black point does, the black point allows me to take this area of the curve and adjust it, but I can only adjust it upwards. I cannot adjust it downwards. It's all the way down now. If I slide this over this way, watch what happens to this area of the curve. It slides up, and I get a very bright background and a washed out nebula. Factor is just a multiplier of this scale. So when I set this to 1.5, which would be over here somewhere, if I wanted to actually move up 3 or 4, that's where this factor comes in. It's just a multiplier on this scale. However, what we want to do with this image right now, we want to take it and make it a little more contrasty. So there's one of these other 2 functions here. In particular, the nth power x to the n choice. That allows you this exponent scale. You've still got the white point and black point settings, but this exponent now will darken the image, but it'll increase the image contrast a bit. So if I take this and slide it up a bit, watch what it does to the image. You can see the contrast went up. You haven't dropped this level, but you've dropped this area now down toward the bottom, and the contrast goes way up in the image. You may want to recover some of the faint data. So you could take the black point and slide it up just a little bit, right? And now you can see you're getting some of the faint stuff, and you've got more contrast in this area. So those are some of the adjustments you can make. The other option, by the way, which is root M, works the other way around. So now, when you're using root X, rather than darken the bright areas and dark areas of the image, it takes the dim areas of the image and makes them brighter without affecting the bright areas. So for instance, if I slide this over, you'll notice all the dim areas will get quite bright, and it didn't really saturate any more pixels. You notice the curve shifted up this way, and I now see all sorts of gas and dust, right? I've lost a little contrast in the image, which I can get back in a few minutes, but I've also boosted the noise somewhat substantially. If you take a look, the noise is quite bad here now. So what you want to do is you want to adjust the sliders, knowing what it is you want to do with the image. So if we take this and we go to none, again, and we stretch it, here's the image I've got. All I really want to do, I want to brighten this image up a little bit more, but I want to maintain at least this much contrast in the image. So what I'm going to do, I'll select this value here, nth power x. Now as I slide the exponent slider over, I better reset the scale here, 1 second. There we go. If I slide this over, I'm darkening the image. And I'm increasing the contrast, as you can see, right? So you got nice contrast in the core now. To me, at least, on my monitor, the background is just a little darker than I would like. So what you want to do now, you can go back to the background weight. You can use the black point slider or the background minimum to actually lighten up this just a little bit. I tend to like to use this background slider to do that. There we go. So now it's not too bad. It's a little lighter. And you play back and forth a bit with the exponent and the black point to get an image to look the way you want. So there's a reasonably stretched or reasonably processed image for the very first stretch of the image. We're actually pretty much very close to being done with this image because it doesn't look too bad, other than it's a little on the noisy side. The advantages of the ArcSignH Stretch show up here. The color has been maintained throughout the stretch, and you notice the stars did not become huge. They didn't bloat as it does when you apply multiple curves. The one downside, of course, is because we've stretched the image, we have increased the noise out here in the darker areas of the image. It's not terrible. If you take a look, it's actually not too bad, given this is a fairly short, I think it's probably about 25-minute exposure. And we've got decent star color. You can see some red stars, some white stars. You know, there's various shades in between. So we've got some decent color in the image. Everybody with me so far?
Trying to be.
Now, the next thing I want to take a look at, we don't really need it with this image, but with some images, galaxies in particular, it's quite useful, is this color decompression. We lose a little bit of color as we stretch the image. As you slide a slider toward the right, you can recover some of that color. So I'm going to take the red slider and slide it a little bit toward the right. Watch what happens to the red in the image. Everybody see it got very saturated? We can go the other way and reduce the saturation as well if you want to. Now it's a little washed out in terms of color. You can do the same for blue and you can do the same for green. Most people don't like to turn the saturation of the green up, but sometimes you have to. We can turn up the blue saturation. And I just want to show you what that will do here. I may have to go a little further to see the effect. Look in this area of the nebula and you'll notice that while the nebula is red, we're now starting to see some of the H beta emission from the central area of the nebula. You notice it's not quite as red as it was. You're getting some of the blue that was there. It's just becoming more prominent. And I can turn it up even a little more. I'll go ridiculous amount here so that we'll see what this does. Yeah, not too bad. And if you take a look at the stars now, we zoom in on some stars. I'm starting to get some blue halos around some of the stars. So I've probably gone a little too far with that there at that point. And you can just dial that down. That was a star right at the corner, so it may just have been an optical issue. Nope, you can see some of it's there. So you can turn this down now to try and minimize some of that. There we go, that's not too bad. And let's see what the center of the nebula looks like. Not too bad. So we can play around again with the color to recover as much as we want to try and get out of the image at this stage. So far, one tool, we've gone from, if I click undo here, from an image that looks like that to an image that looks like that with just one stretch. So it's a very powerful tool for stretching images. And really, it's one of the most flexible ArcSignH tools that there is in the industry. The idea of having this pre-stretch that moves the data up and down in the curve really allows you to bring out more of the image with less work than you can do in some other packages. The catch is there's more experimentation to do to get the result that you want. You can turn it off, you just select none, and then you've got the simpler adjustments. Sorry, did someone say something there? Quiet, that either means everyone is gone, fallen asleep,
No.
or I've completely confused everybody.
I'm trying to figure why my histogram doesn't look like yours.
Did you crop the image?
No, because I got behind. I decided I'd go back to the original.
Okay,
So I crop it now.
if you have not cropped the image, you will have all sorts of garbage data in this area. And that's caused by the stacking artifacts where I dithered the image. So crop the image, take off about, let's say, 0.5 centimeter all around.
Okay.
And then your histogram will probably, and then stretch that image and your histogram will probably start to look like mine.
Okay, I'll do that. I'll show.
So when you crop your image and it makes that copy, so none of them settings apply to that new copy. You have to redo it all.
That is correct. Well, when I say you have to redo it all, you just have to click the apply button. The settings don't change.
Oh, so you just hit the apply.
I could open another image right now and just click apply, and all of these settings would be applied to that new image.
Okay, so that's where the apply comes in. Because I was going to ask you, like, we changed all the, we got our settings in. Do you have to apply it? Done.
You'll notice this checkbox here that says enable sliders.
Yeah.
When you see that, if it is checked, as you move the slider, it will apply, it will apply that setting to the image right away.
Okay.
If you don't check that, then you can slide the sliders, set them the way you want, and then click apply, and it'll apply them all at once. If you have a fast computer, I generally would leave the enable sliders checked because it's easier to see the effect as you do it. If you have a very slow computer and you're familiar enough with the tool to have a very good idea of where the sliders should go for a given image, sometimes you want to set them all and then click apply. Then you can click enable sliders and move them a little bit from that point.
Because I just cropped my picture just now.
Yep.
I didn't initially, and when I applied it, my picture is way out of whack.
That's because you have already stretched the image before you cropped it.
Yes.
If you keep clicking, close down your cropped version and get back to the one that you had originally stretched.
Yep.
Okay, now, show you. Right now, all you have to do is click undo, this arrow right here.
Okay.
Okay, so if you do that, now you should be back to the original image.
Okay.
Now crop it.
Back to the original image.
Yeah, crop the original image.
And now apply.
And then click apply.
Okay, and you can just close the other image.
You can just close the other image. What happened is when you cropped the image that you had originally stretched, you're now applying the ArcSignH Stretch to an image that you have already applied an ArcSignH Stretch to.
Okay.
So you applied it twice, right? Same with any package. If you've got an image that you've already stretched, then the next stretch is going to be completely different. You don't want to use the same one. So that gives people an idea of how the ArcSignH stretch works. I'm going to also demonstrate another stretch here. And
there, before you
yes,
go, just on the right-hand side of the histogram.
Glenn, you're going to have to get a little closer to your mic. You sound like you have a mouth full of marbles there.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
On the right-hand side of the histogram, is
Yep.
that still mildly clipped?
In actual fact, no. It is very close to it, however. The original image had this peak in it, that there were a few stars in the image that were clipped.
Yep.
And I haven't clipped it anymore with my stretching.
So basically, it's still the original slightly clipped image.
It is a slightly clipped image. The original data set was slightly clipped, and I tried not to clip it much more throughout the processing.
Okay.
Okay. The last thing you would do with this image would be to set the black point, and I would be tempted to leave the black point a little high in this image just because there's so much gas and dust in the background around here. If you don't happen to like that and you really want to emphasize the nebula, I haven't had enough coffee yet, folks. You can go to this levels adjustment For those that are familiar with PixInsight, this is like the histogram transformation tool. And I can set the black point wherever I want in the histogram. So I could set it right there as an example. And now I'll get a very dark background, as you can see. Click undo. There. Now, you'll notice whenever I want it to go back, I've been clicking the undo button. Something I haven't mentioned yet, which is quite useful, is this particular little button here. Looks like a text window. That's the process history window. And that keeps a running history of whatever you have done to this image. So you can see I originally copied a portion of an image to make this one. That was the cropping operation. I did an ArcSignH, and you'll notice there's a double set of arrows on the ArcSignH. That tells me that's where I'm at right now. I also did a levels adjustment, and then I hit back so that the two arrows went from the levels back to here. I could click next command and it would then go and do the levels adjustment that I had already done. And I can delete any of these. So for instance, I can delete the levels. If I had 2 or 3 operations in between here, I could delete them. I can actually copy them to another image. I can take an image, open it up, select everything that I've done to this image, copy it to the process history of the other image, and it'll then do the same thing to that image. Not a wise move, by the way, unless they are all images of the same thing, because the settings you use are very, very image dependent. But it's something you can do. The next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to reload the original image, which is this one. I'm going to recrop it. I probably should have saved the cropped version before I did any processing. Would have made life a little easier, but what the heck. There. So now we're back to the original image. Let me just close that down. There we are. And I have to refresh the histogram. There we are. So now we're back to the original image. But now, rather than use the ArcSinH stretch, I'm going to use another stretch that's in ImagesPlus. And it was quite popular and still is, but it was quite popular before the ArcSinH stretch became available sort of to mainstream software. And it's called digital development. Now, digital development is a hyperbolic stretch, so it's got a different shaped curve. And it's not as abrupt, as it were, or as hard a stretch as the ArcSignH stretch. It does, however, bloat stars a little more, but what you'll find is if you have a noisy image, this may be a better stretch to use. It has the same features as the ArcSignH stretch. It's got the actual stretch settings here. They have similar names: background window, background weight. It's not called power anymore. It's called breakpoint for the highlights. This is what you use to brighten the image. The color that you saw in the ArcSignH stretch is now on this tab. Here's color. It also provides a sharpening because the digital development process can leave the image a little soft. So you can actually sharpen it as you stretch it here. There's no real need to. Most people don't. There are so many good sharpening tools in ImagesPlus to use later in the processing, but it is there if you're determined. So in this application, what happens here, in order to brighten the image, we want to move the breakpoint to the left. So as I slide this over toward the left, you'll notice the image gets brighter. You'll notice it didn't get anywhere near as bright as it did for the ArcSignH stretch. And that's because there are selectable ranges here. So for instance, you'll notice there's a breakpoint setting here. And this controls what this value is. Right now it's set to 65535 at this point. I can take that down to, let's say, 1,000. Now it's 1,000 at this point. And if I slide it along here, we'll probably get a decently, little overly stretched image there. All that's really doing is giving you a smaller range to adjust the highlights over. I might actually want to go to, let's say, 5,000 here. And we'll take this up to about 2.
So it's just giving you better numerical precision over the slider values.
That's all that's doing. And this does the same thing for the background weight. I can get better numerical precision over the background weight slider here. Now, that's not too bad. So now we've stretched the image there. We want to take the background and we want to lighten it up. So we're going to slide this over a bit. That's not too bad. Probably want to darken the background a little bit. And these are the same settings, by the way, on the HDR pre-stretch that we had in the ArcSignH. So again, we'll take the nth power. Now the exponent darkens areas of the image. We'll slide it up a bit. Not too bad there. And then we'll just take a little increase in the black point. I'm just trying to get these two images close to one another. And I'll show you why in just a minute. We'll probably want to make it a little less bright. And a little more background. There, that's not too bad. So now we have those two images. But I want you to take a look at some of the large stars in this image versus the large stars in this image. And if I zoom right in, hopefully we can see the difference here. I should be able to slide over to some of the larger stars. Down a bit. That's probably the largest star in the image. Might have gone too far there. Nope, just have it up a little more. There we are. What you'll notice is, in particular, this star and this star, you'll notice that they are smaller on this side. I've dialed in a little more halo than I should have, but you'll notice the bright part of that star is smaller here than it is here. That is one of the advantages of the ArcSignH Stretch, is that it prevents bloat on larger stars compared to the digital development process. You'll notice in particular, this star is substantially smaller than this, oops, it's the wrong one. Here we are. This star right here is larger, for instance, than this star. That's one of the advantages of using the ArcSignH Stretch. The disadvantage is it's such an abrupt stretch that it can emphasize noise quite a bit. So you can see the noise here. And if I can come back to this, you'll notice this image has a little less noise than this image, right? And that's the difference, is that the ArcSignH Stretch is quite a strong stretch, and it will emphasize noise more than digital development processing. So you want to have a properly exposed image with lots of exposure to keep the noise down before you start using ArcSignH. If you've got a noisy image, you might want to stick with the digital development stretch. Any questions so far? Absolute quiet. I'm going to take that everyone understands perfectly. Glenn, you're shaking your head.
When you say it's a noisy picture, is that due to the way the picture was taken? Like, was it taken for too long or something? Or
no, all pictures are inherently noisy. There are several sources of noise in the camera. There is read noise, as an example, just general noise in the electronics. There is a noise due to dark current in the camera, but More importantly, the noise you see in this image, I've exposed this image long enough to overcome all of the camera noise. The noise you see in this image is the noise due to the light itself. It's called photon noise, and it's approximately proportional to the square root of the number of photons you collect. So the more photons you collect, the more noise you also collect. However, the signal to noise ratio improves because the image data climbs much faster, matter of fact, by root 2 than the noise does. So the signal to noise ratio improves every time you double the exposure.
How do you spell shovel?
Sorry, say that again. Somebody asked a question there and I didn't catch it. Oh, okay. So at any rate, to answer your question, Troy, the noise is always there. There's a noise inherent in the light in the sky. You cannot get rid of that noise. Most of the other noise sources you can do something about. It's one of the reasons, for instance, that CCD cameras are cooled. By cooling the camera, you reduce the dark current. There's a noise that's equal to the square root of the number of electrons there are in the dark current. So if you reduce the camera temperature, you can reduce the dark current noise. A DSLR doesn't have a cooling feature, so you get around that by exposing longer. Any other questions?
You said you couldn't avoid that, but you can just by doubling your exposure.
You would have to do substantially more than double the exposure. Doubling the exposure is sort of the almost bare minimum improvement in SNR. For those that have an electronics background, it makes a 3 dB improvement in the SNR. Your eye as well as your ear have a very logarithmic response. So although it sounds like a good idea to double the signal to noise ratio, that's the minimum you get for minimum visual improvement. You barely detect it. It's one of the reasons I'm not a big fan of taking hours and hours and hours of exposure. If you take a 5-minute exposure, a 10-minute exposure is the sort of bare minimum improvement. The next bare minimum improvement is a 20-minute exposure. After that, it's 40 minutes. Then we're talking 80 minutes. Then we're talking 160 minutes to get another sort of bare minimum improvement. By the time you're up to, let's say, 3 to 4 hours, to see the next bare minimum improvement on that is shooting for 8 hours. So I don't recommend that as a way to, make great improvements in your signal to noise ratio. You can go out and you can image for 20 hours, but it's just barely better than a 10-hour shot. Matter of fact, it's not all that much better than a 5-hour shot.
And you're talking about after it's all stacked, right? Not one single 20-hour exposure.
That is absolutely correct. My camera will not do a 20-hour exposure.
Okay.
Typically, the exposures are relatively short. I tend to shoot for approximately 5 minutes per sub-exposure, and then I average a whole bunch of those to simulate a longer exposure. So,
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Nope, okay. So
I was going to ask the rationale for choosing 5 minutes versus 3 minutes or 10 minutes is just to reduce the number of airplanes, or?
Yes and no. Yes, it certainly reduces the number of airplanes. The reason for it is a little bit technical, but I'll attempt to make a coherent explanation here. I make no promises. Remember I said all cameras generate noise. So what we're going to do, I'm just going to take a look at this histogram here. The noise in an image is in a raw camera image that has not been stretched is all down at this end of the histogram. It's all in the very low values. And in order to get basically out of the camera noise so that my image data is not as corrupted by that noise as it would otherwise be, I expose long enough to shift my histogram up this way. So I actually did the measurements and calculated it all out for my camera. There's a paper I wrote that was in the journal. I think it might also have been in Nova Notes, and I will happily send it to anyone that wants the paper on how to calculate what that value should be. If you really are having trouble sleeping, I would suggest it as a good read. Other than that, ignore it. All you really want to do, you want to park the peak of your histogram right here, this central peak that represents the sky background. You want to park that, now I'm talking your camera histogram here, the one you see on the back of your camera. You want to park that between 1/8 of the way up and 1/4 of the way up. If you do that, you will be out of the camera noise. Now that is carefully calibrated on my camera, which is a Canon camera, and it holds for almost all Canon cameras. I do not know if it holds for the newer mirrorless cameras. I will not swear to that, but it certainly holds for everything before it. I don't know for certain that it holds for Nikon, although most of the things that I have seen on the web would tend to make me believe it does. For almost all DSLRs, if you expose so that you are 1/8 to 1/4 of the way up from the left side of the histogram, and that's where this peak is, and this bottom end is separated from the left side, then you are out of the camera noise. Once you expose to that point, exposing longer does not get you any improvement. What I mean by that is, let's say, for example, Jerry, that it took me 5 minutes to get to that point. Exposing for 10 minutes doesn't give me any more improvement because I could have just taken 2 5-minute shots and averaged them together and get, for all intents and purposes, the same result as that 10-minute exposure. The advantage, however, is what you just said. I'm more likely to get an airplane or a satellite trail or a gust of wind in the 10-minute exposure than I am in either of those 2 5-minute exposures. And if I do get it affecting 1 5-minute exposure, I've only lost half my data, not all of my data. So there's really no good reason to expose longer than it takes to get out of the camera noise. All you're really doing is increasing the chances that something will go wrong. And we all know nothing ever goes wrong.
If you're using a very narrow band filter, then you might need longer exposures to get any signal there then.
What will happen is you will need a longer exposure to get this histogram up to about 1/4 of the way. But you still don't want to push the histogram past the 1/4 point. It'll just take a longer exposure to get there.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Good, thank you.
Yep. Any other questions before I move on?
You said, I just missed that, but you said you weren't going to crop. Did you crop actually after the stretch completely? Can you crop before the stretch?
You can actually crop at any time. I cropped before I did the stretching here, just so that it was easier to make sense out of the histogram. Around the edges of the image are stacking artifacts from the fact that I dithered. And if you don't crop those out, you will see all sorts of garbage down here that are a function of those stacking artifacts, not a function of the portion of the image that I want to keep. So I cropped it just so we could get a reasonable looking histogram. There's no requirement to do that. You can crop after you stretch with no problem at all. Okay. Now, the next part of this processing is a little bit more stretching. But normally what I would do at this point, we've stretched the image to the point where it's actually pretty reasonable. You take a look here, but it's got a little noise in it. What I would do is I would now take some of that noise down. I'm not going to do that right now. Tonight we're going to focus on stretching the image. When we're all done, I'm going to save this image as it is. And we'll come back to this and I'll show you the difference if you do the noise reduction. But that's a topic for another night here. 1 second, I'm just going to save this so we can come back to it quickly and easily. Okay. By the way, when you're saving images in ImagesPlus as a FITS file, you have two options. You have uncompressed and lossless compression. Lossless compression takes substantially less disk space. However, it's only usable then by ImagesPlus. So if you're processing an image that you plan to take into any other package like PixInsight or Registar or anything like that, you want to save it as uncompressed. But for now, I'll save it as losslessly compressed. So now what we're going to do, we're going to sort of finalize the stretch on this image. And there are a couple of other stretch functions here that I just want to show people before we go too much further. Auto stretch and auto min max are for the most part completely useless. They're just to give a very quick stretch of your original image so you can see what areas you want to crop out, and then you'd click undo. They don't really do too much. Negative is exactly what it sounds like. It takes the negative of the image. Mostly useful for masks, but for instance, if I take this and I say take the negative of that image, you get the idea. Undo that. By the way, as long as you are not using layer combines, ImagesPlus has an infinite amount of undos, and you can get to them all from the history window. Or you can keep clicking the undo button if you're really bored. We also have a histogram contrast stretch. That can be quite useful, but only on very quiet data. This is not very quiet data, so I'll give you an idea. You do have some control over it that you don't have in some other packages. We'll use a uniform histogram here, and I can play with the brightness of this data, but it's really the only slider that's active. You'll notice I can't slide these around at all. They're locked. I can, however, slide the brightness slider. So we're just going to apply it as it is. And you can see it definitely distorted the color and sort of made a mess of it, but it did up the contrast. I'll click undo. There's a, once it's finished, there is another one that I like to use from time to time called background highlight contrast, where you can now set the contrast on the background and the highlights separately. So for instance, I can take the background, or sorry, the highlights, and I can brighten them up. I think I went the right way there. Yep. I can increase the contrast. I apologize for the mess it's making of the color. And you can do the same for the background independently. That can be useful on quiet data. This is not quiet data, by the way. So those are some of the other stretch functions that you have. You would not tend to use these on an image that did not already have an ArcSignH stretch or a digital development stretch applied. The other stretch down here is a simple brightness and contrast, and that's one that most people are familiar with from Photoshop, and it is exactly what you would think. You have a brightness control, you have a contrast control. This contrast range will up the effectiveness of this slider. It's sort of a fine adjustment. You also have a couple of other useful sliders here. Most of the ImagesPlus controls will let you set a minimum and a maximum value to apply the adjustment to. So for instance, I might want to up the contrast on the bright stuff in this image, but leave the dark stuff like the sky background alone. So I could do that. Before I do that, however, I'm just going to do this so you can see what happens if I don't do that. We'll up the brightness of the image. You notice the sky background got bright. So now we're going to do the same thing. I'll undo that adjustment. By the way, when you click the undo arrow, you'll notice that behind the scenes, the ArcSignH Stretch keeps coming back up. That's because it was the last thing that was done to the image. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I don't want to brighten the background. So I would normally slide this slider up to set it above the background level. You can slide that slider up, and it'll be a real pain to do. I'll do that one more time here. Because you'd have to go measure the background and do all that sort of stuff. You can just click, I have to shrink this down. You just click this min apply, and then click on the image at the minimum level you want to apply the contrast boost. So for instance, we don't want to boost anything that is any dimmer than, let's say, this value. Just arbitrarily picking a spot on the nebula. You'll notice that it set the slider to that value. For those that are familiar with Photoshop, this feather range selects a range above and below this value, and it will blend it all together. Usually, it depends on the image, but let's say we want a feather over a brightness range of about 4,000 pixels. Now watch what happens. It brightened all the nebula up, but it did not brighten the background up. It makes a mess of the shot. There are reasons for that too, but I just wanted to demonstrate that you can set a level where it will just brighten and increase the contrast in the nebula. And most of the controls in ImagesPlus have that feature. In this case, we want to slide the feathering up a bit to sort of blend everything together. There we go. But you get the idea. And that's just a general brightness and contrast stretch. It's available in Photoshop and almost any package. You can see it can do a reasonable job at sort of setting the final level for the image if you want to just play around a little bit. There's not a bad M8 image right there. And you can see if we do a refresh on the histogram now. There we go. So there's my sort of final histogram. I saturated a few of the stars, but I got a rather nice image of M8. Not my favorite tool for doing it, but it does come in handy every now and then. Just undo it here. There we go. The next stretching tool is, I'm going to skip levels just for a minute, is called microcurves. Now this is a standard curve adjustment for those people that are familiar with curves. I'm going to ask the question before I go on. I keep talking about curves in images. Are there people out there that are unfamiliar with the function of a curve, of a transfer function? Okay, I see Troy is waving his hand. Okay, let me see if I can explain what a curve is. It tends to make things a little more understandable here. A curve represents the mathematical function that you're going to apply to the input data to get the output data. It's called a transfer function. So if you think of this bottom axis as being the input value for any given pixel. So for instance, if I park my mouse right here and you look down in the bottom right-hand corner of the display, you should see in parentheses a value of 134, 84, 89. You see that? That represents the red, green, and blue pixel values right underneath my cursor. So with that input value, we're going to pick the red channel here, 134. That would be, those by the way are 8-bit values. This is a 16-bit display, but 134 would be up around about here. The reason I say that, you have to know a little about image processing in general to make some sense out of those numbers. An 8-bit number can go between 0 and 255. It will be fully saturated at 255. A 16-bit value can go between 0 and 65,535, and it'll be fully saturated at the 65,000 number. So what's displayed here is the 16-bit scale. If I wanted to convert that to 8 bits, I'd take this and divide it by 255. That makes this 128. So 139 would be about here. sorry for the math, but it's just something you'll have to get used to, learning the difference between 8-bit and 16-bit images. So what this curve does is any input value along this axis will be converted to an output value along this axis according to this curve. So as you can see, I'm going to use 16-bit values here, but this midpoint right here of 32,767 would come out as an output value, and there's no scale mark, but this is also 32,767. A straight line that way is no change in the image. You follow that so far, Troy? Okay, if I now want to brighten the brighter portion of this image up, I'll change that curve to look like this. Now what happens is that same input value of 32,000 has an output value that's probably up around 50,000. So it got brighter. Okay, and this curve describes the relationship between the input values here and the output values here. Does that make sense? Good. Okay, ImagesPlus only has 2 adjustment points on its curves. It used to have a curve adjustment very similar to Photoshop. You used to be able to click points and dial them up. I cannot give you a good reason why Mike got rid of that. Other than many of the users of ImagesPlus found it kind of redundant. What they ended up doing was little adjustments and then save it and then do another little curve adjustment. So Mike came up with this concept of micro curves that only have 2 adjustments. So I can adjust the brighter portions, of the curve here. I can adjust the darker portions here. This is now sort of a typical S curve for increase in contrast. But now I have these 2 sliders, and these 2 sliders limit the brightness range over which this curve is applied. So for instance, if I slide this up, you'll notice the background did not get darkened anymore. If I slide this down, the really bright stuff won't get brightened anymore. I can actually now take a curve and do this, and it will only apply it to the mid-range values. The dark stuff did not get changed because I slid this slider up. Anything below this value would not be changed. It affects the range over which this curve is applied. Does that make sense? Jerry, you got a real puzzled look on your face. Try turning your mic on.
Sorry, no, that's just my natural look.
So if you were doing this particular curve with this particular slider setting in Photoshop as an example, you would set a bunch of data points on the curve to be all zeros, or actually, sorry, to have a straight slope up to this point lining up with this slider, and then the curve will take effect. It's just the way Mike did it. It seems to work well. It's just different. I can't give you, as I said, a very good reason for why you would do it that way versus drawing points on a curve as you would do in Photoshop, but it works. So I'm just going to undo that curve adjustment. And curves are quite useful. And there's something, I'm not going to get into that just yet, bear with me. So that's sort of the curve adjustment. There's another adjustment here called general stretch functions. Now, these are a whole variety of stretches that are very useful for particular types of processing. There is a linear stretch, which just basically takes a linear curve like you saw. Let me see here, I'll bring that curve back up. And all it does is it takes this point and moves it over here, but leaves this as a straight line. You can also take this point and move it over here. So you're changing the slope of that line. It's good for sort of making wholesale brightness and contrast changes. There's a hybrid ArcSignH stretch. Now, if you wanted to apply additional ArcSignH stretches to this image, this is the one you would use. You would not use this ArcSignH Stretch. This is for an image that has had no stretch applied. I don't know the full details of how that came about in the software, but effectively this is a much milder stretch. You would not want to apply this ArcSignH Stretch. This is a much gentler curve if you use the ArcSignH Stretch function here. There are two functions here, however, that are very useful, especially if you're doing globular clusters, as an example. This particular function, root X, as I've shown you from the ArcSignH pre-stretch, what this does is it brightens up the dim areas of the image while leaving the bright areas untouched. So we're going to bring that histogram back up. Here's our histogram. And I'm going to slide this down here a bit. And if we slide this slider over toward lighter, what it's going to do is going to brighten up the dark areas of the image. There. And you can see the histogram has shifted the bottom end upward. This didn't really change much. So if we click undo, watch the histogram. You notice this didn't change much. It changed maybe a little bit, but not that much at all. But this changed substantially, and I can make it quite a bit different if I slide it down some more. Again, watch the histogram. You can see it slid up here. The background is brightened up substantially, as have the dimmer areas of the nebula. If I now want to sort of keep some of that adjustment, but I want to get the contrast back, that's the job of this black output black slider. As I slide it along, watch what happens. I get the contrast back, but now I still have some of that fainter stuff that was out here. And I can play around a bit with that to tailor that adjustment the way I want. And I can really begin to emphasize the contrast in here, but still maintain all this faint gas and dust around the outside of the nebula. So the general stretch functions are really good as a follow-on stretch to either digital development stretching or the ArcSignH Stretch, ArcSignH Stretch rather. So remember that when you're processing your images, if you've got a reasonably quiet image, you use this as your initial stretch. If you've got a noisy image, you would use this as your original stretch. Then typically you would go to the general stretch functions to sort of improve the image still further. You may want to use a curve adjustment here and there. And then as the final step in stretching your image, what you want to do is set the black point in the image, and you use levels for that. So for instance, if we come along here, I really want to, you notice the same histogram that's here is now displayed here. I have rough adjustments now. I can take the black point and make this value black, a value right there. You can see that that upped the contrast substantially. I can do the same for the white point. I would not want to move the white point in this image because I've got stars that are right at saturation. But if my histogram sort of stopped here, I could slide the white point down. You do that just by selecting white point and then adjust the slider. So for instance, I can do this. This will brighten the whole image, but it'll saturate a lot of the stars, as you can see. Undo that part of the adjustment. And finally, we have the ability to control the midtones. Now, the midtones are the brightness values that are partway between black and white. And if I slide, oops, wait now. Here's the curve now. So you can notice that I've slid the black point over here, and you notice that the curve no longer starts right at the corner. It's moved in somewhat. And now I might want to brighten up the midtones a bit, and I do that by putting a little kink in the curve by sliding this midtone slider over. And you'll see the effect here. The background is still dark, and the nebula has brightened up substantially. Just to give you an idea. you'll notice that this is a straight line. So it's straight to here and straight down to here. Straight lines really don't tend to look too good, but there is a gamma adjustment, black gamma, that puts a curve on that straight line, as you can see. And you can do the same thing for the white levels up here. I could continue that curve with the white gamma. What I would do at this point is I would now adjust the black point a little more. And now we got a pretty good M8 image. So you can see you've got lots of gas and dust. You can see the dark lanes out here, right? You've got reasonable nebulosity all around. You might have a little less contrast than you want there. You can adjust that, again, by going back here to the midtones and turning them down just a little bit. A little bit more. So you can see now you've got some contrast here. You still have those nice dark lanes at the outer edges of the nebula. And we have a reasonable looking M8 image. Any questions so far?
Looks so simple, but very hard to determine what the actual control values should be. You know, it seems to be an infinite possibility.
There is an almost infinite possibility, and what you want to concentrate on while you're learning this software is not what the actual levels of these controls are. It's more concentrate on what the controls do. So for example, you want to know that when you're in the general stretch functions and you've selected nth root X, that this root slider brightens up the dim portions of the image. It's that kind of thing that you want to know. The rest is experimental with each image. As I said, there is no preset value for these sliders that will work for every image. What works for one image makes a complete and total mess out of another image. And that's the same for any image processing package. There's some rough guidelines, and the guidelines are you slide the root slider this way to make the background brighter. How much you slide it there depends on how bright the background was to begin with. So there's no, hard and fast rule in any package that I've ever come across. The ones that do implement some hard, fast rules, and there are some, they're sort of one-click packages. They generally get you a little bit of the way there, and then you have to take it out to something like Photoshop that, again, has that infinite adjustability to really fine-tune the image. Now, one thing I wanted to show you, we've taken this image and we have done nothing to this image except stretch it. Brighten it up, in other words. But the problem is hidden in that the scale of this image is quite small right now. It's only at about 20%. If we take this image, however, and we look at 100%, look at the noise in the image. Ignore the hot pixels. Those are a function of me not doing a proper combine. But look at the noise that's in that image. It's actually kind of bad. If I make the image small, that will go away. But I don't want to make the image small. I like having a big image. As you can see, when I get to the brighter areas of the image, it looks much better, right? I've got nice quiet data here. It's because this is a brighter portion of the image, and the signal to noise ratio that you had in the original data is much better here. That happens with any image when you stretch it. It's also why you want to do your stretches in small increments and do noise reduction and sharpening between those increments. So what I'm going to do, this is not really, sorry, go ahead. Oh, thought someone had a question there. What I'm going to do, I'm going to pull up this image. Oh, I should show you this too while I'm at it. Every step along the way, ImagesPlus made another image and it saved it to my drive. That's how Mike implemented the history dialog. So for instance, if we go here, oops, I have to close this file open, sorry. If we go to the history dialog, every adjustment we made along the way is stored here in the history dialog, and there's a corresponding image that's been stored. When I close this, all of those other images will go away unless I tell it not to. So you will find that you get all sorts of images, and if you have a big image that will take up a lot of disk space, it'll all go away when you close that image. But what I wanted to do, remember I said I was going to store the image after my initial stretch. So this is after I did the initial stretch. And I'm going to zoom in on that. So now we're looking at what should be, if I get the, just going to do that, there we go. So now we're looking at the same area in both images. So this is the initial stretch. No, not quite the same area. No, it's the same area, or it will be. There we go. This was just the initial ArcSignH stretch. This was after we applied more stretching to the image. And take a look at the noise that showed up in here. Right? It really looks, to be quite blunt, quite bad. So what you want to do is after the initial stretch, you want to take some of that noise down, then apply some of those other stretches, and in between each one, reduce the noise. So we can do that. You can actually go back all the way to the ArcSignH stretch on this image. So now we have the same image as the one I stored. So I can close the one that you can see that we're doing it. They look exactly the same. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to take some of this noise down. There's a bunch of different noise reduction techniques in ImagesPlus. Some are more complicated than others. And as you can imagine, the more complicated ones work much better. I'm not going to use those tonight. I'm just going to show you why it's important to do your stretches in small increments. So I've stretched it. Now I'm going to take one of the noise reduction filters that are available. I am going to use Selected Neighborhood. It does a reasonable job at preserving detail. So it won't blur the stars too much, and it won't blur the nebula too much. It will mostly blur the background. So it's being applied now. And now you can see the background got smooth. The stars did blur a little bit, there's no doubt about it. I can also limit the brightness values that I apply that to. So for instance, we'll slide that slider down. That'll bring back most of my stars. Oh, I gotta click apply, sorry. So now I've got reasonable stars and the background is much better. We look at the nebula itself, it's much smoother. And what we're going to do now, we're going to go to that history dialog. What I've done, we did an ArcSignH stretch, I just inserted smoothing. So now I'm going to tell it to do the next command. And it's going to do the general stretch that we used. And if I scroll back over to the corner, now what I would normally do is I would now take the noise down a little bit more. I'm not going to do that just yet. I'm going to tell it to do the levels adjustment again. And now we've got that image. We've still got the dark areas like we had before, but look at the noise level. It's much lower than it was. The stars are still reasonable. They're not perfect. As I said, this is not what I would normally do for noise reduction. I would typically take the stars out of the image and use a mask and make sure I get just the spot I want. But I wanted to show you the difference when you simply do a little noise reduction in between your stretches. Remember what that looked like without this one smoothing operation after the initial stretch. This was very, very noisy through here. The noise is now greatly reduced. And you can see the nebula itself down through here. There's a little noise, but nowhere near as bad as it was. Does that make sense to people?
So far, sort of.
And that's the same, by the way, for any image processing package, whether it's PixInsight or ImagesPlus or Photoshop. You want to stretch a little bit, take the noise down, then stretch a little bit more. And then when you sort of have the image almost the way you want it to look, that's when you would apply your sharpening. And we'll get into that in future sessions. We'll go through sharpening the images. We'll go through noise reduction. That'll probably be the next session will be noise reducing an image. And I'll go through some of the more complicated methods of doing noise reduction. They work exceptionally well. ImagesPlus has a wonderful filter for doing noise reduction. It's a frequency-based filter. There's a bunch of terms I'll have to try and define for folks, and I'll probably send them out in a little presentation first, and we'll get into that. But I wanted to go over stretching tonight. So that's sort of the basics of getting your image from something that looked like this, there we go, to something that looks like, I'll just load that other one here simply because it's quicker than making it go redo all the processing, to something that looks more like this, right? And that's simple stretching of the image. The downside, of course, is that you bring the noise level up, and there are ways to reduce the noise as you go. We're just not getting into those tonight. But as you can see, ImagesPlus, and for that matter, any astrophoto processing package makes it much easier to do the stretching than it can be in things like Photoshop. You can do it in Photoshop, absolutely. There are some layer techniques that work exceptionally well in Photoshop. You can use them in ImagesPlus as well because it also supports layers, and we'll get into that in the future. But to get from this to this with a few mouse clicks is much easier than doing the equivalent shift in image brightness in Photoshop. And I know we've got a couple of Photoshop users out there. I know Dave Hoskins, I think, is on the list here. And I suspect, Dave, you have to use a few more stretches than one ArcSignH stretch to get that far in Photoshop.
Yeah, probably 4 or 5.
And there are a bunch of layer techniques that you can use in Photoshop as well.
Yeah, I'd use masks as well.
Yeah, but again, this is no mask, just one stretch applied got me from this to this. And that's sort of the reason why people go with dedicated astrophoto processing packages. It's not that you can't do it in Photoshop, it's just so much easier in a package that has the tools that are meant for the kind of images you work on. You know, as an example, if I sort of, I'm going to cheat here a minute. I'm going to take green. Oh, one thing I didn't show, which I probably should. These 3 toolbars here, or these 3 buttons here, 4 buttons. This, whatever I'm working on, whatever stretch I apply, will affect the red, green, and blue channels. If I click this button, it will just affect the red channel. If I click this button, just the green channel, and this button, just the blue channel. There are times you actually want to do that, but not in the examples we did tonight. That is true for everything except curves. I don't know why it's not true for curves. Curves has its own color selection here, and it's for historical reasons. When Mike originally wrote the package, he didn't have these buttons up here, and he selected them down here, and he just never got rid of it. But let's say we're going to turn mid-tone or the low level green up a bit. Should make the image look pretty crappy. There we are. So here's an image that's suffering from light pollution, right? The background should be black, but it isn't. It's a crappy reddish green. Everybody see that there? If you have Photoshop, you can figure out ways to do an adjustment to get rid of that. If you have a package like ImagesPlus, or PixInsight for that matter, I think it has tools for this as well. There's a color balance tool. And all I have to do is click Neutralize Background and click on a spot in the image that I want not necessarily black, but gray. And watch what it does. There we go. Now my green background is gone. I'm a little overly red because I had boosted the green, but it made this area of the image almost the right color. I could now go fine tune the rest very quickly. Again, Dave Hoskins, that's something you can do with calculating levels in Photoshop and subtracting them, but I don't think there's a one-click solution to do that. ImagesPlus does, however, give you that, and you can you can adjust color balance for neutralizing the background. You can adjust color balance on midtones. Now what that does, that tends to make the midtone that you select a neutral gray, and it's great for galaxies. It's not so good for nebula. Watch what will happen here. This should do some wonders for the color. There we go. So I tried to make the image gray in that area where I clicked, and needless to say, that sort of destroyed the image. We can just back out of that. And I can back out from adding the green from the curves. Remember, I have an infinite number of undos. I can go all the way back to when I first read that image in if I had wanted to. And close down some of these because they're filling up my screen. So we get any questions on basic image stretching with ImagesPlus?
So it's practice time.
It's practice time. The reason I gave everybody that image is that when you are looking at the recording of this session later, you can actually use the settings that I have used to get the same result. Not that I would suggest that is the way to do it for any image, but obviously those settings give you the same result I got on this image. So you can experiment from that point and play around with the different stretches and see the effect.
Blair, I
Just
see
what the doctor ordered.
Sorry, someone else was, just before Bob talked.
Just make, yeah, I think it was David.
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. I noticed you're working with a FITS file. How did you stack? Did you use Deep Sky Stacker or?
No, I used ImagesPlus.
Okay, so that's how.
Right here, you bring this little dialog up. You select all your light frames. You select any dark frames, flat frames, the usual thing.
Yep.
You go to the Process tab. You select what you want it to do. You can apply filters. You can normalize, grade your images. The grade is based on stars, by the way. You can then align, and you can combine in a number of different ways. They're set using this button. And then you just basically click Process and go away and drink coffee, and it does everything for you.
Okay.
It has a better stacker than Deep Sky Stacker. It was the original reason I bought ImagesPlus. I had a number of images that Deep Sky Stacker did not do a good job on, and ImagesPlus was able to do them. The current stacking algorithm will even match distortions in the image. So for example, if you are using a refractor that has pincushion distortion, it can still stack based on stars out here if those same stars have pincushion distortion applied to them that is not applied to stars in here. It will still line everything up properly, and it will solve for the distortion.
Wow.
Deep Sky Stacker In its most recent version, Deep Sky Stacker may do that now. It never used to.
Dixon site does that.
Yeah, a lot of the newer Astro packages will do that. The stacking, I mean, I can give you an idea of how it works here, just as an example. I won't stack 500 images or whatever, but so we can go, let's see. I'll just grab a couple so that it can whiz through it. Now I just got to remember where I still have some raw data to stack. Bear with me. Probably from one of the galaxies I've been shooting here at home. Let's see, we'll take eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Let's see if there's raw data in this. Nope. I tend to remove the raw, after I stack them and do the processing, I remove the raw data off my hard drive. It's backed up on several other drives, so I just have to go find something that's got raw data. Bear with me a minute. There we go. The whale should have some raw data. There we go. So I'm just going to grab a couple of light frames. We'll take 4. I'm going to grab a single dark frame, and it's not going to be used as a dark. It's going to be used as a hot pixel map, and I'll show you what I mean by that in a minute. And I'll grab a flat frame. We'll go back to the Process tab. And in here, you can select how you want the files to be stored. I'm taking lossless 16-bit fits. They can be stored as 32-bit floating point. They can be stored as 16-bit fits or 16-bit TIFF, whichever you prefer. If you want to actually use dark subtraction, you click this button, this little tab right here, and this will subtract that dark frame. If you have a reasonably modern DSLR camera, but before the cameras had on-sensor dark suppression, click this and it'll attempt to match the dark frame that you've got to the exposures that you're using. But I don't tend to do that. I tend to do this, which is it uses the dark frame to find out where the high and low pixels are, and it will apply that as a hot pixel map to remove hot pixels in the image. It's not doing a dark frame subtraction. The reason I do that, it's much quicker, but also my camera has on-sensor dark suppression, so I don't have any dark signal to subtract off. It would be meaningless. This specifies how you want to convert your image in terms of Bayer conversion. I want an RGB output. Most people will want that. You can reduce noise in the green channel if you want, and this builds a super pixel but leaves you with a black and white image. So it'll take red, blue, and green and combine them. You can select additional processing here if you want to remove high pixels. If you're using a CCD camera that has blooming issues, you can correct that here. If you want to normalize your light frames, and I suggest you do if you're doing flat frame processing, it improves the flat frame capabilities. Generally, you set it to normalize to the image set average. You can take maximum, minimum, or specify your own values, but image set the average is almost always the way to go. If you are grading your stars, grading your images rather based on stars, you can select here the eccentricity to use, or you can just click auto, which is what I tend to use, but I don't tend to grade my images. My tracking is reasonably good rather, so I don't have too many images that have trailed stars. You can select the type of star alignment you want to do. You can do a quick align, where you can tolerate meridian flips and all that sort of stuff, or you can do the full alignment, which I'm going to do here. Once they have been aligned, then this is how you will combine them. So here you can do a straight average. I don't tend to use straight averaging because things like airplanes and satellite trails show up in your images. I tend to use min-max excluded average. What that will do is it will go through all of the data, and for every pixel, it will throw out the highest value and the lowest value and average the rest. That tends to remove satellite trails, meteors, that sort of thing. You can also do a median, a minimum combine, a maximum combine, or sigma clipped averaging or sigma clipped median. If you're a deep sky stacker, I think they call that kappa sigma clipped average, but that's what this is.
Yeah.
You can specify the deviation factor. Finally, you can specify the name of your output file down here. Once you do all that, you click save. We want to then, I haven't selected any extra filters, so it's grayed out. I can normalize, I can align, and I can combine. I could also grade, but I won't bother here. And you just click process, and it does everything automatically after that. So what it's doing now, it's converting all of those raw Canon files to RGB fits files. Then what it's going to do is it's going to take those files and it's going to calibrate them. So it's going to sort out the flat frame, sort out the dark frame, bias if I had selected it, and it'll do all the calibration to each of the 4 images. So now it's calibrating, it's creating the master calibration frames. It's calibrated image 1 and 2. You get the idea. It's like watching grass grow, but it is faster than some packages out there. And finally, it'll finish calibrating all 4 images. Now what it's going to do, it's going to convert those images from a bare file, which is in a bare matrix format. It's going to convert them to RGB. So now you have separate red, green, and blue channels. And it does that because when it does the alignment, it's going to align the red channels and the green channels and the blue channels. It actually aligns by color channel. Now it's normalizing each of the frames, so it's gone through and figured out the average for the set for every pixel, and now it's normalizing by that. And then finally, now it'll start the alignment. And you can sit here and watch it do its alignment. There's a reason I only picked 4. So what it's done is it's gone through the first initial image, which it will use as the reference, and it has found 230 stars that it can align on. Of those, it selected 86.
Can it, does it choose which one is the reference image?
It picks the first one as the reference, but you can select which image to use as the reference as well.
Can it automatically pick the best image as the reference?
No, if you use the automatic stuff, I think it picks the first one. All that really does is it's deciding to line all of the other images up with that one. That's what it means by the reference image. It's not a quality indicator. It's just which image it matches all the stars to.
Select the excess.
And you can see now it's on the 3rd image. And then finally, it'll go to the 4th image.
Found a few more stars too.
Yeah, a few more. It'll cut them back to roughly the same number when it's finally done. So now we've got all 4 images aligned, and now it's going to combine them with min-max excluded average, but it's going to do it on a per channel basis. So it's now doing the red channel. Now it's doing the green channel. And as you can imagine, once it does green, you can sort of figure out what it's going to do next, the blue channel. And now we have a completed image. It's all calibrated. It's all stacked, aligned, the whole bit. And if I click display combination, it will show me that aligned image. And there it is.
Fantastic.
Keep in mind that that's only 4 exposures out of probably close to 2 hours worth of data. So it will be quite noisy. But if we do an ArcSignH Stretch on it.
Test. Yep.
There's the whale galaxy, there's the hockey stick. And as you can see, the background is quite noisy, right? but you get the idea. It will do all its own stacking, all its own alignment, everything you want in one package.
So
Now,
does it set the Bayer pattern based on the camera that you selected there?
yes,
Or
it does.
can you input your, if the camera's not there in the list?
Use one of these.
Yeah. Okay. I see. Perfect.
So you can do any camera in the list and it will select it automatically. Assuming your camera is not in the list, you can use one of the generic debearing settings, right? And finally, it will also do a variety of one-shot color CCD cameras and mono CCDs as well. One thing I will mention, you notice I have bare at capture white balance selected. That's generally what you want to use. There are some other settings. This is color at capture. That's when you're capturing an image that is not a bare image. So if you're capturing JPEGs and you want to stack them, you would use color at capture. This allows you to do a bare image, but it does not scale the bare matrix pixels for color. So it doesn't apply the in-camera white balance. That would be acceptable, but you probably have a little more color adjustment to do after that's done. This particular setting, basic bare raw, it does not debear the image. It does everything as a bare image. You really only want to use that for some noise measurements and some other specialized measurements that you may want to do. ImagesPlus, by the way, has a feature under special functions, I thought. Oh, sorry, it's been moved. Here it is. It's under image set operations. And you can calculate your camera's read noise and gain. And you do it with a couple of flats and a couple of biases, but you have to capture them in basic bare raw mode. Now, this is all automatic stacking. You can do all this manually as well. You can also stack planetary images as well. You can even do video processing. You can take video images and align all the video images and do lucky imaging. There are better packages out there for doing that than ImagesPlus. ImagesPlus will do it. But there are other packages out there, PIP and AstroStacker come to mind, that are a little easier to use potentially, and they don't use some of the weird video formats that ImagesPlus uses internally. So I would suggest using them. One other thing I want to let people know, as ImagesPlus went through and did all of this stacking, all of those images that it made, the debared image, the aligned images, those are all still stored on my hard drive. If I'm happy with the stacking result, I can click that delete button and it will delete all those images. If I close this dialog box without clicking delete, I got to go in and delete them all manually. Not impossible by any means, it's easy to do, but why? You just click the delete button and they're all gone. So that'll give you an idea of the ImagesPlus stacking utility that's there. It's all automated. It's literally fire your images at it and go drink coffee. You can also process other images while stacking. ImagesPlus is fully multi-threaded and it'll make use of every computer core you've got, including your graphics processor. The graphics processor support is turned on under system options, and you'll see it down here. Use GPU acceleration. That greatly speeds up some of the filtering functions, things like Gaussian filters and that sort of thing. And when I say greatly, we're talking better than 10-to-1. So if you've got a supported graphics card, it's worth clicking that on. Any other questions so far? Silence.
I have a curiosity question.
Yeah, go ahead.
How long does it normally take to do the stretching routine that we saw this evening?
Usually, if I were to do a simple routine like that, a couple of minutes, 5 minutes. I never use a simple stretch anymore. there are ways to do stretching, for example, that I'm looking out the door here. I'm in the office here in our house, and my dog is leaving nose prints on the window at the moment. Sorry. But at any rate, I'm going to turn a light on here so people can see me. There we go. The basic idea behind the simple stretch that I did tonight, it's what people who are beginning to learn image processing would use. And I wholeheartedly suggest you use it for a while. Don't attempt to jump right to the complicated things right off the bat. You will be sorely disappointed. They take a lot of practice to get used to. But typically what I do now, I do that same ArcSignH Stretch that you saw. I leave the background quite bright, and then I bring it into something called the feature mask, where I nuke all of the stars from the image and I make a mask out of the result. Then I apply that mask to another ArcSignH Stretch of the original image. And what it does is it gives me a very big stretch on the image, but it does not bloat the stars at all because the mask prevents that. It also limits the stretch applied to the background because, of course, in the mask, the background is darker, and therefore the noise does not come up enough to even worry about reducing. All techniques we'll get into over a few sessions, but I would not advise trying to do those while you're getting used to the software. Get used to the tools. The next tool we're going to look at in ImagesPlus, and it won't be tonight, but I'll do a few more of these sessions. We'll start looking at some of the noise reduction and filtering tools that are available. Some of them will require some knowledge of math and image processing in general. We will take a cursory look at those. I'll just give you a quick example here. If I go to the image that we just processed, there we go. So we looked at some of the basic blurring functions here in the standard smoothing and noise reduction. Box is just a simple average. You set the size of the box and it averages those pixels. These are other methods of doing that. You can do Gaussian weights, binomial weights, median filters, those sorts of things. These blurs here, and they are blurs, preserve a little more detail than the standard non-adaptive blurs here. You can set the minimum and maximum pixel values to apply it to. You can set a feather range on that. And finally, you can say, apply the filter at 100% strength, 50% strength, whatever you want. That's one of many blurring and noise reduction tools. There's another tool here, the multi-resolution tool. And what this does, it allows you to do the same thing. You can smooth or sharpen with this tool, but it allows you to do it in various detail sizes. So for instance, I can blur the largest size detail in the image. I can
wavelet layers, is it?
What's that?
Wavelet layers?
This is a wavelet system, yes. I can go all the way down to the finest, and I can actually then say, you know, how fine is fine. I can adjust them here. That can be quite useful. It's great on galaxies. The issue is that it takes a lot of practice. For instance, if I take this fine adjustment tool and I slide it up even a little bit here, watch the result. The stars will get sharper. You probably saw the stars brighten up a little bit there. But if I zoom in, look at the fine grain noise that just showed up. It's because it emphasized it all. If I go and take this and slide it up, now watch what happens to the noise. Got even more prominent. So you have to have some knowledge to use this. So for instance, you might not want to use the fine adjustments. The reason is that's where the noise is. You might want to instead increase the median. Right, so if I dial up the medium amount, it will take the noise up not that much, as you saw. And if we look at the nebula, I can dial that up a little more here. Oh, sorry, I have to zoom in a little more so you can see the effect. So you can see it sharpened up this area of the nebula quite nicely. You can play around with that to get the image to look the way you want. It's pretty straightforward, but it requires a little playing around. So a little experimenting to get used to what the different detail level sliders do to an image. So for instance, if I'm zoomed right in on the image here as I am now, and I really ridiculously boost the large detail, watch the stars. You can see the stars now stick way out. However, there's a saving grace. A lot of the dialogues for blurring and sharpening have this reduce artifacts button. And if you reduce the artifacts, it will take out most of the ringing around the star. You notice the little circular donuts around the star. You notice they're gone now. So it's applied the sharpening, but it took out most of the artifacts that were caused by that sharpening. And you can, increase the fine detail. This will bring the noise up a bit, of course. Just wait for it. So you can see the noise is starting to come up in this area now. But again, it's a experimental process. It's less experimental if you know the math behind it. You can see, oh, by the way, you can see the difference in the image sharpness. I'm pointing at the screen like that does any good. Look in this area of the image, and I'll apply what I just did again, and watch what it does in this area of the image. Watch how it sharpens up. You see that? So again, it's rather experimental. You will not find that the settings I would use to sharpen this image will sharpen any other image satisfactorily. It's get used to what the sliders do. Get used to the fact that you can sharpen detail in a variety of image resolutions. That gets carried even further with some of the other functions down here, like the frequency filter. The frequency filter is a filter that can sharpen or blur an image, but it does so in what's called the frequency or spectral domain. And I'm not going to get into what that is right now, but needless to say, you have very fine control over the frequencies that are affected by the filter. And it does a wonderful job at noise reduction if you remove the stars first. The reason I say that is most filters, when you apply noise reduction, it always blurs the image to some extent, and you don't want to blur the stars out. That looks really crappy. So you can remove the stars using another tool, blur the background and the nebula, and then put the stars back in very quickly using this package. Any other questions there?
I think there's enough to keep us going for a while.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to limit tonight just to stretching. People that aren't familiar with image processing in general, open that image that I gave everyone the link to and play around with it. Play with the various stretching functions, get a feeling for how much the noise will increase with each type of stretch, and what settings you can use to sort of keep the noise under control. In the ArcSignH Stretch, the more you slide the power slider over, the brighter the image, but the more noise you get.
Noise.
You remove some of the noise with the background weight slider as you slide that over, but that will make the background lighter and lighter. Eventually it becomes too light. When you start getting the background too light, you select nth power, X, and you slide the exponent over, and that will begin to darken the background. And you can play around between background weight and the exponent slider, as well as the black point will now lighten the image up a little bit. Those are all things to experiment with and get used to how they affect various images. And it will be very image dependent. As people that use Photoshop can tell you, the the curve adjustment on one image is not the same curve adjustment they use on another image. They end up being totally different, and expect the same thing here. Okay. Anything else?
Wow. Thank you, Blair.
Well, hopefully I haven't bored people to tears.
No, far from it.
And like I said, we will do more of these sessions. I'm thinking the next session, we will continue to use this image. And what we'll work on is we will work on the various methods of noise reduction as sort of a next step, because typically the workflow in ImagesPlus, or any processing package for that matter, is to stretch the image a little bit, then reduce the noise a little bit, then potentially sharpen a little bit, and then stretch some more, and sort of rinse and repeat to finally arrive at the image you want to have. It's the best way to keep stars under control and the noise out of the background, is to do everything in small steps.
Blair?
Yes, sir.
Now, ImagePlus, now this system doesn't require any third-party plugins or anything like that. It's all strictly on
None
ImagePlus.
whatsoever. Nope. Everything, it's self-contained. The one thing it does not have, which it is sorely lacking, is a help file. When you click help, you get help topics. And that's the limit of the help topics. However, one of those help topics, this one right here, will take you to Mike Unsold's ImagesPlus homepage. And there you will find literally several hundred image processing examples. And they are worth reading. Mike also has a bunch of YouTube videos up. They are still relevant, but it is for older versions of ImagesPlus, but it does do a good job of explaining some of the fundamentals of the software. And on Mike's webpage, there are a bunch of PDFs as well that sort of start covering things like image stretching, you know, noise reduction, that sort of stuff. It is worth a read through his webpage. There's a huge volume of information there, to the point where you have to read it, or you have to become familiar with his webpage just to know where everything is. How much longer that webpage remains there, I do not know, simply because Mike is getting out of the image processing business, which is why he made ImagesPlus a free download for everybody. But at least for now, his webpage is there, and it is well worth taking a walk through it, and potentially a copy of it if you've got software that will do that for you.
Yep, yep, I do.
And again, you can get to his webpage off the help here. It's just www.mlunsold.com. I forget his middle name, but that's the L. Last name is Unsold, U-N-S-O-L-D. Okay. Well, thanks, everybody. And like I said, we will do more of these. They will become, unfortunately, increasingly more technical. I'm going to try and stick to the simple tools for the first pass at noise reduction. I will show people the other tools, but don't get too hung up on them. There's even a tool, for example, that will let you remove weird pattern noise, but you have to be very familiar with what an image spectrum looks like, because you have to go in and paint out the noise in the frequency spectrum and then convert it back to an image. None of which would be considered beginning stuff. And you really don't need to use it on your typical image processing. There are band removal tools if you've got a camera that has banding. ImagesPlus has one of the better band removing tools after you learn to use it by removing the stars first, of course. It's got all sorts of color control. The newest version of ImagesPlus, which is the one that everyone is downloading, has one new feature here called Reduce RGB. This image doesn't have too much of it to remove, but for those that use Photoshop and I think use PixInsight, there's a tool called HLVG, I believe. It stands for Hasta La Vista Green. It's a green removal tool. ImagesPlus does basically the same thing. You click green and click apply, but it will also do it for red or blue. It will not do combinations, so you have to pick them one at a time. But if this image had a green cast, I could click that, click apply, and what it will do is it will dial down the green in the areas where the algorithm thinks it should not be. So if you take a look at that, you'll notice that the background got a little blacker. Right? If I click undo here, watch the background. You notice it's a little more green now, and now it will be a little less green. And you can control how much green you take out with this slider. You can go ridiculous. There you go. You get the idea. But it's a useful tool for removing green casts from your image or for removing red light pollution from your images. It works really well on making the background look right. And if you play around with the slider a bit, you can even get it so it, for instance, if I take out the red in the image here, you notice the background got less red, but it did not completely remove the red nebula. And you can play around with that to remove red from the background and still keep a decent amount in your target. So it's got a variety of tools like that in this newer version that are quite useful for us urban imagers. You know, it's also got the usual distortion correction tools. This is a really useful tool, and I might as well touch on this one now because it's a one-click tool that's quite handy. If we, 1 second till I get rid of that color adjustment that I just did. Okay, I'm going to zoom in on this image, and we're going to take a look at the stars. I want one that's fairly bloated. No, well, these should do. So here are some stars. Now, David, you use Photoshop for your processing. Do you have a star reduction routine that you use?
Yeah, I've been using Noel Carboni's actions.
Right, and if I remember correctly, those tools are erosion-based, and one of the problems you run into is that stars that are really close together get little bridges between them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, you're gonna love this tool. You can see we got lots of stars in here, lots that are very close together. If you go here and you say star and halo shape reduction, this will let you do several things. And one of the things it lets you do is reduce the size of your stars. Generally, you don't want to push it too far, so you generally take the defaults. You can, however, reduce the size of one color channel more than the other. So if you have an achromatic refractor that tends to leave blue halos around the stars, you would click that off, and then you could adjust the blue halo removal to be higher than the red and green, and it would remove that blue halo around your stars. However, we're going to leave all three set the same. And David, I want you to pay attention to, I'm looking for some stars that are close together here. See these batch of stars here?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we're going to come back to those. Take a look at this star, and we're going to reduce the stars in the image. Notice the star just reduced slightly,
Yep.
but take a look at these stars, no bridges.
Mm.
Right? You can dial this up substantially further. You can get a little ridiculous with it because it will do some strange things, but notice the star got quite small. So if we do an undo, actually, I'm not going to do the undo that way. I'm going to do it this way because that way it won't pop up any other dialog boxes. Watch the size of the stars. You see they got bigger. Now they get smaller. See the difference?
Yeah.
You'll also
Dramatic.
notice that the stars that are close together do not have bridges. It's a wonderful star removal tool.
Mhm.
It does, however, affect the nebula ever so slightly. It's not bad as long as you leave it at the default setting. So for instance, if we undo that adjustment, let the stars get big again. There we go. And we go over and we look at the nebula. We'll go to the core of the nebula. At least we will if I can find it. There we go. So here are some stars in the nebula. And if we just leave it at its default, the stars will reduce and the nebula is not really damaged much at all. If you push that, however, you can start to get artifacts in and around the nebula. Now you'll notice the nebula is starting to get a little noisy. You see that?
Mhm.
Right? So it's generally a good idea to leave the star size reduction at its default. And if you want to reduce the stars more, apply it multiple times. So for instance, here's the stars with a little bit of reduction. And if I want to apply it again, oh, this is something I better show everybody. If I click apply, all it's going to do is exactly what I just did. It won't apply it again. Even if I close this and open it, it remembers that this is the last thing that I did. If I want to apply it again, I have to click this button. And what it does is it locks the adjustment that I just did. Now I can apply this again to the same image. And you see the stars got really small now, to the point where I'm starting to lose some of the smaller stars. But I didn't really boost the noise. Right, so we go here, now you can see the stars have been reduced somewhat substantially from what they were originally, which would be right here. See the difference?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's got a really good star removal tool. Now, one other thing that it has.
I see there's a elongated star correction. If you
Yes,
have a
there
bit
is.
of trailing, right?
Yeah, so if you have star trailing, you can correct that star trailing either vertically, horizontally, left diagonal, which is sort of that way, or right diagonal, which is that way. Quite often you will have a star trail that's in between those. There are several ways to handle that. You can correct it a little bit vertically and then a little bit horizontally until you get round stars. Or you can simply rotate the image a little bit to make the elongation fit along one of these axes, then reduce it and rotate the image back. That's generally what I do.
Yeah, you can't select just a certain area, say one half of your image, if you notice your train might have been out of the line or something?
In actual fact, you can, but you do it with a mask.
Okay.
All of the adjustments in ImagesPlus can have a mask applied, and you just simply make a mask that's black on one side and white on the other. You can blur it a little to blend the effect in the middle, and you get exactly what you just said.
Okay.
We will get into masks and layers eventually, but we'll go through all the sort of standard tools before we go there. You know, it's got a bunch of special function tools here, and we'll take a look at those as time goes on. This one, this multi-point flatten, allows you to, it's something like the dynamic background extraction in PixInsight, a little bit more manual. So when you select points on here, you can tell it to automatically do it, but you can also then go in and dial each of the points up and down to remove gradients and do all sorts of fun things. Background compensation is an earlier version of this, sometimes still useful. Multi-scale decomposition is similar to the multi-scale processing in PixInsight. Pixel math is just what it says. You can add, subtract, multiply, or divide a pixel by a constant. Image math allows you to add, subtract, multiply, or divide one image into another. Add noise does just what it says. Edit pixels allows you to go in and change the values of pixels individually. Not quite sure why you'd want to do that, but maybe you got a hot pixel that you want to remove and you don't want to blur the image to do it. You could go in and do it that way if you want it. And again, we'll go through some of the other functions as time goes on. So that's sort of the end of the image stretching session. And if anyone has any questions, please ask. And if you come up with questions as you go through it, by all means, fire me an email and I'll happily answer them.
Thank you very much, Blair. This has been great.
Thank you, Blair. That's
Okay.
great, yeah.
And
We
like I
will
said,
attempt to put a video up in a day or so.
no
That's
problem.
great, Jerry. Thank you.
And like I said, we will do several more of these sessions. It helps to pass the time while we're all sitting in COVID-19 isolation.